All right, I want to turn to postmodernism in education and connect the more theoretical, philosophical, historical material on postmodernism with the postmodern educators' notion about how practice should go. I want to read some quotations with some interspersed commentary from Henry Giroux, who in the American context is one of the leading postmodern theorists, connecting the abstract themes of postmodernism with concrete educational practice. Now, Giroux draws a great deal on Paolo Freire, another leading postmodern theorist, but for the American context, Giroux's language is more accessible as a postmodern writer than some of the other postmodern educational theorists. So from an essay entitled Border Pedagogy as Postmodern Resistance, and here's the first quotation. Giroux, well-informed, situating postmodernism as an intellectual movement against all of the other mainstream philosophical movements in the language of discourse and philosophy of education, idealism or a more religion-friendly movement, or realism or a more modern and scientific-friendly movement. Giroux is positioning postmodernism against both of them in the following quotation here. Quote, postmodernism radicalizes the emancipatory possibilities of teaching and learning as a part of a wider struggle for democratic public life and critical citizenship. It does this by refusing forms of knowledge and pedagogy wrapped in the legitimizing discourse of the sacred and the priestly. Pause right there. That is to say, we're going to reject idealistic or religion-friendly, sacred and priestly forms of philosophical legitimation for our practices. Picking up the quotation again, it's rejecting universal reason as a foundation for human affairs. Interspersing again here, universal reason being the realist or modern scientific framework. As postmodernists, we're going to reject the universal reason claim. Picking up the quotation again, claiming that all narratives are partial and performing a critical reading on all scientific, cultural, and social texts as historical and political constructions. All right, translating that language a little bit, all stories, scientific stories, cultural stories, and so forth, are social constructions by the social group within which they are generated. Our job as postmodernists is to be critical, right, of them, to diffuse the rhetorical masks, to look for the deeper story, right, and so forth. And then we have the claim also about narratives being partial. There is no such thing as a full, whole, complete story. And so on. Okay, next quotation from Giroux. Criticizing the modern world and its framework, despite all of its rhetoric about being inclusive and extending liberty and equality for all, the argument here is that that it takes all of the groups that are not white, not male, not kind of paradigmatically Anglo-Saxon Protestants and so forth, relegating them to an alien other group and then subordinating them. Right? So what we now will have is a claim about what the modern world does to those other groups. Quote, within the discourse of modernity, the other, capitalized O, other, not only sometimes ceases to be a historical agent, but is often defined within totalizing and universalistic theories that create a transcendental, rational, white, male, Eurocentric subject that occupies the centers of power while simultaneously appearing to exist outside of space and time. Pausing on the quotation here, what we then have is, from the modern perspective, modern philosophy, modern intellectual constructs are all about taking the white, male, Eurocentric type of life, right, the type of being, and making that the one universal right way of being, and therefore subordinating all non-white, male, Eurocentric ways of being. Picking up the quotation again, read against this Eurocentric, transcendental subject, the other is shown to lack any redeeming community traditions, collective voice, or historic weight, and is reduced to the imagery of the colonizer, unquote. Next quotation will be in Postmodern Analysis of Modern Education, Modern Cultural Life. What it tries to do is make everybody who isn't white into a white person, everybody who isn't male into a male person, everybody who's not heterosexual into a heterosexual. It tries to take all of these different groups and assimilate them to the dominant white male Eurocentric heterosexual model. And so what modern education does is cause people who are not fitting into that model to give up their identity. Quote, "Moreover, students who have to disavow their own racial heritage in order to succeed are being positioned to accept subject positions that are the source of power for a white dominant culture." That quotation focuses on racial issues, but the argument here is that whites hold all of the power, and they force people who aren't white to give up their own racial identities and to act white or to internalize white ways of thinking if they're going to succeed in the white kind of world. Next quotation. Then what the postmodern educator then has to do is oppose that tendency of modernism to try to assimilate everybody to the white male way of thinking. Quote, "For those designated as others need to both reclaim and remake their own histories, voices, and visions as part of a wider struggle to change those material and social relations that deny radical pluralism," unquote. So the truth about the world is that there are all of these different groups that are incommensurate with each other. There is no one right way of group being. We should not try to be assimilating. Instead, what we should be doing is affirming all of the different group identities, and as educators, helping students to reclaim, to re-identify themselves with their own groups, their own racial groups, their own ethnic groups, their own gender groups, their own sexuality groups, and so forth, and encourage their development as members of those groups to which they properly belong. And what this then means also is not only as educators to focus on how to relate to students, but also we first will need to attend to teachers, the teachers who are going to be teaching the students. We need to remake the teachers who are coming into the education program, particularly teachers who by the time they get to us as professors of education, who have already been raised in modern society and assimilated and taught explicitly or even implicitly, and who have probably internalized the notion of the white male Anglo-Saxon Protestant as the proper way of being. We need to focus on teacher re-education as well. Quote, "This suggests that to the degree that teachers make the construction of their own voices, histories, and ideologies problematic, they become more attentive to otherness as a deeply political and pedagogical issue." So most of the teachers in contemporary society are white. Most of them come from Anglo-Saxon background. Most of them have been conditioned to think in terms of liberal capitalism, modern society, right, and so forth. What we need to do then is to teach them that that way of thinking, their way of thinking, is problematic, right? Not to take it for granted, not to think of themselves as training people to be cogs in the modern capitalist machine, to become self-reflectively critical of their own upbringing, of their own identities. To the extent that they do so, that will then put them in a position as teachers to be more sensitive to other groups and other ways of thinking about it, non-white ways of thinking about things, human-centered ways of thinking about things, non-heterosexual ways of thinking about things, and so on.